In the winter of 1942, the Atlantic was a graveyard of steel. Convoys meant to supply Britain and Allied forces were being torn apart by German U-boats, their torpedoes striking with deadly precision beneath the cold waves. Each week, another dozen merchant ships vanished beneath the sea, taking with them tons of food, fuel, and ammunition vital for the war effort. America, newly thrust into global conflict, faced an impossible equation. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. Traditional shipyards, with their slow, meticulous rivet-by-rivet construction methods, could not keep pace. It took over 200 days to launch a single vessel. The ocean was bleeding Allied supply lines dry, and the nation needed a miracle, a way to turn shipbuilding into mass production. Out of this crisis rose a man who had never built a ship before, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Known for constructing massive dams and highways, Kaiser believed shipbuilding could be revolutionized with the same principles he used on land: prefabrication, assembly lines, and above all, speed. His peers in the maritime world mocked him, calling him a dreamer with no understanding of naval engineering. But Kaiser didn't listen. He looked at the U-boat war as a race, not of firepower but of logistics, and he was determined to win. He envisioned vast shipyards working around the clock, where hull sections were welded together like automobile parts, not painstakingly riveted. In his mind, ships could be built in days, not months. It was a ridiculous notion, one that the old guard laughed at. Yet desperation has a way of turning ridicule into necessity. The U.S. Maritime Commission took a chance on Kaiser's vision, funding emergency yards across the West Coast, in Richmond, California, Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. Thousands of workers, many of them women and minorities who had never seen the sea, poured into these new industrial fortresses. With torches in hand and determination in their eyes, they became the builders of freedom. But innovation would soon hit a wall. The old riveted designs couldn't be adapted to Kaiser's prefabrication dream. Riveting was too slow, too labor-intensive, and required skilled craftsmen that simply didn't exist in the numbers needed. Kaiser's engineers needed a breakthrough, a way to fuse steel faster, stronger, and simpler. The answer would come from a group of unlikely innovators who discovered that by replacing rivets with welds, entire hull sections could be joined in hours instead of days. The shift from riveting to welding would change everything, marking the beginning of the fastest shipbuilding program in human history. America's war machine was about to do the impossible: turn raw steel into seaworthy vessels faster than the enemy could sink them. The first prototypes looked crude, even dangerous. Skeptics warned they would crack under pressure or fall apart in storms. But when the first welded hull held steady on its maiden voyage, the laughter stopped. The ridiculous had become revolutionary. Henry Kaiser's shipyards were no longer just factories. They were the beating heart of America's industrial war effort. And as smoke rose from their furnaces, a new kind of warfare was being born. One fought not just by soldiers, but by welders. The race to build ships faster than the ocean could swallow them had begun. Henry J. Kaiser was not a naval architect, nor was he trained in shipbuilding. He was a builder of impossible dreams, a man who had carved highways through mountains and dammed mighty rivers. When the war began, most experts dismissed him as an industrial opportunist, a construction magnate chasing government contracts. But beneath his calm exterior was a relentless visionary who saw war production not as engineering, but as assembly. He believed that America's strength wasn't just in its factories or steel, but in its people, the ordinary workers who, if given the tools and the chance, could outproduce any army on earth. The Navy's shipyards were bound by tradition, their methods perfected over centuries of rivets and slow precision. But Kaiser had no interest in tradition. He saw inefficiency as the true enemy. "We're not building yachts," he once told an admiral. "We're building lifelines." That statement summed up his mission: to flood the seas with ships so fast and so many that the U-boats would choke trying to sink them all. When Kaiser took over his first yard in Richmond, California, skeptics said it couldn't be done. The location was too small, the labor force too inexperienced, the deadlines too brutal. Yet Kaiser looked at the shipyard the way an engineer looks at a problem. Every obstacle was just another point of innovation. He tore apart the traditional shipbuilding process, breaking it into hundreds of repeatable tasks. Hulls would be divided into prefabricated sections built in parallel. Welders would replace riveters. Conveyors, cranes, and massive dry docks would carry the burden once held by time. Speed means survival, Kaiser said, and he meant it. To him, every wasted hour meant another freighter lost, another convoy destroyed. He worked his crews day and night, fueled by coffee, patriotism, and urgency. But Kaiser's true genius wasn't just in organization, it was in people. He understood that America's manpower was locked in untapped potential. When men went to war, women filled the yards. Housewives, teachers, clerks, and farmers became welders and machinists, their faces hidden behind goggles and sparks. It was Kaiser's shipyards that gave birth to the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter. Under his leadership, the workforce grew to hundreds of thousands. In Richmond alone, more than 90,000 laborers worked around the clock in shifts so intense that workers sometimes fell asleep beside the hulls they were building. Yet they kept going, because they knew that every ship they built carried food to soldiers, fuel to planes, and hope to the front lines. The first ships that rolled off Kaiser's lines were Liberty ships, simple, rugged freighters built for one purpose, to carry war supplies across the U-boat-infested Atlantic. But Kaiser wasn't satisfied with good enough. He wanted better, faster, stronger. His engineers, led by ship designer Henry A. Pearson, began working on the next evolution, the Victory ship. Unlike the Liberties, these would be faster, larger, and more durable, with welded hulls and powerful engines that could outrun submarines. Critics again said it couldn't be done, but Kaiser's yards proved them wrong. In a matter of months, they built what used to take years. Each new hull that slipped into the Pacific was a message to the Axis. You can sink our ships, but you can't sink our will. By 1943, Kaiser's methods had spread across America. His name became synonymous with industrial miracle. From Portland to Baltimore, yards adopted his techniques and America's ship production skyrocketed. The sea that once belonged to the U-boats was now filled with ships bearing the stamp of Kaiser's defiance. He had turned the impossible into the ordinary. And though he never fired a shot, Henry J. Kaiser had done something extraordinary. He had changed the course of the war with nothing but steel, sweat, and belief. The man who had defied the sea had proven that in total war, victory didn't just belong to soldiers, it belonged to builders. The war was not only fought on the beaches of Normandy or in the jungles of the Pacific. It was fought in the deafening clang of American shipyards, where men and women turned steel into salvation. By 1943, the rhythmic pounding of rivet guns had become a relic. The old way of building ships, hammering thousands of red-hot rivets by hand, was too slow, too fragile, too bound by tradition. In its place came a blinding storm of sparks. Welding had arrived, and it would change shipbuilding forever. Henry Kaiser saw what others couldn't. Welding wasn't merely a new tool, it was a revolution in speed and strength. Traditional riveted joints took hours to align, drill, and seal. But welding, melting steel into seamless bonds, could fuse two massive plates in a fraction of the time. The problem was, no one had ever tried welding on this scale before. Critics warned that the heat might warp the steel, that welded seams could crack under ocean pressure, that an entire ship might split apart in rough seas. But Kaiser wasn't one to listen to doubters. He brought in metallurgists, engineers, and, most importantly, ordinary workers willing to learn. And learn they did. In workshops scattered along the Pacific coast, thousands of untrained laborers became welders overnight. Women who had never held a torch before mastered the art with steady hands and fierce pride. They were nicknamed Kaiser's Sparks. For many, this was their first job, their first step into a world beyond domestic life. Now they were part of an industrial army, anonymous heroes forging the steel arteries that would feed a global fight. The welding process itself was brutal and mesmerizing. Inside the shipyards, the air was thick with smoke and electricity. Arcs of light hissed and danced along seams of raw metal, filling the night with the hum of energy. The heat-scorched faces, gloves smoked, and the smell of molten iron hung over everything. Yet the workers kept going, hour after hour, shift after shift, because they understood something deeper than orders or pay. Every spark meant progress. Every weld meant one step closer to victory. Welders became the backbone of Kaiser's miracle. Where a traditional Liberty ship took months to build, A welded Victory ship could take weeks. Soon, welders grew so skilled that they set challenges among themselves, competing to see who could seal a hull the fastest without a single flaw. These competitions drove morale higher than any speech or slogan could. The yards became a place of pride, where people from every background, immigrants, farmers, former miners, stood side by side and built ships that would outlast the war. The results were astonishing. Welded ships weren't just faster to make, they were stronger. Riveted joints often leaked under stress, but welds held firm, creating hulls that flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. The Navy began to notice. Reports came back from the Atlantic. Ships built in Kaiser's yards were surviving torpedo hits, limping home when others sank. Welding, once doubted, had become a secret weapon. But this revolution wasn't without its scars. The work was dangerous. Explosions from trapped gases, burns from molten steel, and collapses from fatigue were common. Some welders never came home, yet their sacrifice was rarely mentioned in newspapers. They were unsung soldiers in denim and helmets, fighting a different kind of battle, one fought with precision and flame. By the end of 1943, over 500,000 Americans had learned to weld. What had once been a craft for specialists had become a national skill. Kaiser's gamble had paid off. The skeptics were silent now. Welding had turned chaos into control, and his shipyards were producing faster than anyone thought possible. In just 5 days, a Victory ship could be born, tested and sent to sea. The welders' sparks had not only changed the way ships were built, they had ignited a transformation in industrial warfare itself. And from those blinding sparks, the glow of victory began to take shape. Beneath the cold, unforgiving waves of the Atlantic, Germany's U-boats prowled like silent predators. They were the wolves of the sea, lethal, cunning, and relentless. By 1942, they had crippled the Allies' supply lines, sending convoys of merchant ships to the ocean floor. Every ship lost meant hundreds of soldiers stranded, factories starved of raw materials, and nations trembling at the edge of collapse. Britain was choking, and America knew that if the Atlantic fell, so would the war effort. The challenge was brutal: build ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. Henry Kaiser, the builder who had already defied every expectation, took this challenge personally. The ocean had become his battlefield, and his weapon was speed. His shipyards, stretching across Richmond, California, and the East Coast, ran like war machines. Floodlights turned night into day, trains carried steel around the clock, and the air echoed with the hiss of torches and the pounding of hammers. The race against the U-boats was not fought in open waters, but in these factories of fire. Every day, new hulls slid down the greased ramps into the sea, replacing those the Germans had destroyed just weeks earlier. The Germans watched in disbelief. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, once boasted that his submarines would cut America's supply lines to ribbons. But he hadn't counted on Kaiser's miracle. His yards were producing Liberty ships and Victory ships at a pace that defied logic. What once took 8 months now took mere days. And each ship was a promise, each hull a defiance of fear. Allied convoys that once sailed in small numbers began forming massive armadas, stretching beyond the horizon. What the U-boats sank by night, Kaiser replaced by dawn. Welders joked that for every torpedo they launch, we'll launch another ship. It wasn't far from the truth. This industrial surge became a psychological weapon as much as a logistical one. German intelligence reported it with disbelief. America has found a way to make ships faster than we can destroy them. It was a statement that symbolized the turning tide of war. Inside Kaiser's yards, the pace was merciless. Workers clocked in for 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Food trucks rolled through the yards like supply lines on a front, delivering coffee and sandwiches to men and women too busy to stop. Even the night sky glowed orange from the endless welding arcs. There was exhaustion, yes, but also pride. They weren't just building steel. They were building survival. In Richmond's yard number 3, the record was shattered when the SS Robert E. Peary was constructed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a feat so extraordinary that even the press called it a miracle of modern industry. For the workers, it was proof that America could outbuild death itself. The U-boats still struck, of course. Convoys bled ships in the North Atlantic, and the blackened oil slicks marked where men had died. But now the balance had shifted. Instead of despair, there was determination. For every Liberty ship lost, 2 more joined the fleet. The flow of supplies, tanks, food, planes, ammunition, never stopped. It was as if America had found a way to turn time into a weapon. Kaiser's methods began spreading across the nation. Other shipyards adopted his welding processes, his prefabrication systems, and his worker training programs. Soon the entire industrial coast was pulsing with the same furious energy. By 1944, the U-boats' reign of terror was breaking. Their numbers thinned as Allied sonar and depth charges hunted them down. What once was a nightmare for the Allies had become a death trap for the Germans. The hunters had become the hunted. The sea, once their kingdom, now belonged to the endless line of Liberty ships marching across the horizon. And at the heart of it all was Kaiser's vision, a belief that America could overwhelm fear itself through sheer will, ingenuity, and speed. The race against the U-boats was not just a contest of weapons, it was a contest of endurance, of imagination, and of courage. In that race, the welders' sparks burned brighter than any torpedo flash. They built in the chill of November 1942, as storm clouds gathered over the Pacific and Atlantic alike. Something extraordinary unfolded on the California coast. At Richmond Shipyard No. 2, Henry Kaiser decided to attempt the unthinkable, a full-sized Liberty ship built from keel to completion in less than a week. The idea seemed ludicrous even to his own engineers. Shipbuilding had always been a patient craft, months of riveting, assembling, and testing. But Kaiser's empire didn't operate on patience, it ran on pressure. Every hour lost meant convoys sunk, and men drowned in cold black waters. So when Kaiser declared that he would build a ship in 5 days, the world scoffed. Riveters and welders alike laughed nervously, whispering, "The old man's gone mad." Yet Kaiser wasn't gambling on luck. He was gambling on the system he had built. Prefabrication, assembly line logistics, and welded joints instead of rivets. The ship in question was the SS Robert E. Peary, named for the Arctic explorer who reached the North Pole. Kaiser's crew planned to reach a different kind of pole, the peak of human endurance. The countdown began before dawn on a grey November morning. Torrents of rain turned the yard to mud, but thousands of workers swarmed like ants. Sheets of steel were hoisted by cranes with mechanical precision. Sections of the hull, each pre-assembled weeks prior, were lowered into place with the timing of a conductor's baton. The welders' arcs flared day and night, sparks cascading like comets. The smell of burnt metal filled the air, mixing with coffee, steam, and adrenaline. No one stopped. No one slept. The rhythm of construction became hypnotic. Clang, hiss, roar, repeat. Reporters gathered in disbelief, cameras rolling as if documenting a miracle in motion. By the second day, the ship's skeleton stood tall and defiant against the grey sky. By the third, its bulkheads were sealed, its decks taking shape. And by the fourth night, floodlights illuminated a sight that would echo through industrial history. A completed hull, ready for launch. At dawn on November 12th, the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the ways into the cold Pacific. Time of construction, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The cheers from the crowd echoed across the bay, mingling with the blare of foghorns and the thunder of factory whistles. Kaiser had done the impossible. A full-fledged merchant ship, weighing thousands of tons, built faster than a single bomber could be assembled in an aircraft plant. The newspapers called it the 5-day miracle, and rightly so. The achievement sent shockwaves through both Allied and Axis ranks. For the Allies, it was a symbol of hope, a testament that American industry could outpace even the most destructive forces of war. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. Intelligence officers reported that the Americans can now produce ships faster than we can destroy them. Hitler himself reportedly dismissed it as propaganda until photographic proof reached his desk. But behind the glory and the headlines were the workers, unsung and exhausted. Women with grease-streaked faces, men with burned gloves, foremen shouting through the noise. They had turned welding torches into weapons of victory. Some of them collapsed after the launch, too tired to cheer. Yet all of them knew they had built something greater than steel. They had built proof of human will. The Peary would go on to serve across the Pacific, hauling supplies, soldiers, and machinery that fueled the liberation of islands and nations. It wasn't the most beautiful ship, nor the most advanced, but it was a beacon of possibility. And it changed everything. The 5-day miracle became the benchmark for what American ingenuity could achieve when pressed against the wall. Kaiser didn't rest on his triumph. He demanded more speed, more ships, more innovation. "If we can build one in 5 days," he said, "then one day we'll do it in 3. His words weren't bravado, they were prophecy. The miracle of the Robert E. Peary marked not just a milestone in production, but a turning point in the psychology of war. From that moment on, the world understood a truth that would echo through history. America's greatest weapon was not its tanks, planes, or ships. It was its ability to build the impossible. By 1943, the hum of America's shipyards had become the pulse of a nation at war. From Portland to Pascagoula, from Richmond to Baltimore, steel replaced silence and sparks replaced stars. Henry Kaiser's revolution had spread like wildfire. His prefabrication and welding techniques were no longer experimental, but essential. The United States had become the great workshop of democracy, an industrial colossus that could forge a fleet faster than an empire could sink it. Every ship launched was another artery of life stretched across the oceans, carrying tanks, food, medicine, and soldiers to the far reaches of the world. The term arsenal of democracy, first spoken by President Franklin Roosevelt, had become a tangible reality, roaring in every forge and echoing in every shipyard whistle. But it wasn't just machines that powered this miracle, it was people. At the heart of this living factory were men and women who had never built ships before the war. Housewives became welders, farmers became riveters, high school dropouts learned metallurgy under floodlights. They came from every corner of America, united by the belief that their hands could help win the war. In Kaiser's yards, nearly 40% of the workforce were women. Rosie the riveter was no myth here. She was a neighbor, a sister, a mother, and she worked with the precision and toughness of any man beside her. Kaiser believed in people as much as steel. He built childcare centers beside his yards, cafeterias that served 20,000 meals a day, and medical programs that would later evolve into Kaiser Permanente. He knew that if you took care of workers, they would take care of victory. And they did. The yards never slept. Shift whistles blew at dawn, at dusk, and again at midnight. Trains brought in sheets of steel. Cranes lifted entire sections into place, and entire hulls rose from the ground like iron miracles. Reporters described the scene as a city within a city, a world of flame, noise, and creation. Kaiser's approach wasn't simply about building ships. It was about building systems. Every component of a vessel, from engines to cabins, was manufactured separately, tested and then joined in seamless precision. His engineers called it modular efficiency. Historians would later call it the birth of modern industrial logistics. The results were staggering. By the end of 1943, one new ship was being launched on average every 63 hours. Every 63 hours, another artery of hope surged toward the front lines, and the enemy took notice. German U-boat commanders, who had once celebrated their dominance in the Atlantic, now found themselves overwhelmed. The ocean had turned against them, not through weaponry but through sheer production. The industrial machine of America had become unstoppable. In London, Winston Churchill marveled, "The prodigious outpouring of American industry is the decisive factor in this war." He wasn't exaggerating. The sheer scale of production had transformed logistics from a vulnerability into a weapon. For every Liberty ship lost, 2 more were already steaming from port, loaded with munitions, oil, or rations. Even the Pacific, once an empire's domain, was now bridged by supply lines stretching from Hawaii to the Philippines. Kaiser's yards were not isolated successes. They were the blueprint of Allied triumph. He had taken the philosophy of mass production from the automobile industry and applied it to the oceans. He had proved that innovation could be faster than destruction. By 1944, the first Victory ships rolled out, stronger, faster, longer-lived successors to the Liberty ships. They were the ultimate expression of everything Kaiser had learned. America had mastered the art of speed without sacrifice, of quantity without compromise. In a world torn apart by fire, the United States had built an engine of hope. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a metaphor. It was an unstoppable tide of steel and sweat, rolling toward victory. The clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the shouts of foremen, all became a single unbroken symphony, a hymn of industry, a declaration that freedom could outbuild tyranny. The arsenal of democracy was not just a phrase, it was America's heartbeat made metal. By late 1944, the tide of war had shifted, and so too had the ambitions of America's shipbuilders. The Liberty ships, once hailed as the miracle vessels of production, were beginning to show their limits. They had carried the Allies through the darkest years, slow, sturdy, and vital, but the world's oceans were changing. Faster, deadlier submarines prowled the Atlantic. The Pacific War demanded longer voyages and heavier cargo. America needed something beyond speed. It needed endurance, efficiency, and power. Thus was born the Victory ship, the proud successor to the Liberty fleet, a vessel not just for war but for the peace that would follow. The Victory ships were designed with every lesson the Liberty program had taught. The engineers and shipwrights who once labored to meet quotas now aimed to redefine maritime engineering itself. These ships were longer, 455 feet of welded steel, and faster, with new turbo-electric engines capable of pushing them past 17 knots, nearly twice the speed of their predecessors. They could outpace U-boats and keep formation with fast-moving convoys. But what truly set them apart was vision. The Victory class wasn't meant to be disposable. It was meant to endure. America's planners foresaw a post-war world where these ships would still sail, carrying not bombs but grain, not tanks but trade. The Liberty ships had been the workhorses of desperation. The Victory ships would be the chariots of dominance. And once again, Henry Kaiser's name was written all over this revolution. He refused to slow down. His yards in Richmond, California and Vancouver, Washington shifted production overnight. Prefabrication remained the core principle, but now precision and refinement joined speed. The welders and engineers, seasoned by years of war production, executed the new designs with near-surgical efficiency. Blueprints that once took months to draft were revised in days. The tools of improvisation had become instruments of mastery. One engineer at the Richmond yard recalled, "We no longer felt like we were racing against time. We felt like we were racing toward perfection." Each Victory ship carried a name that reflected the spirit of its mission. United Victory, Fortitude Victory, Liberty Victory. These weren't just ships. They were floating testaments to the will of a nation. Their hulls were stronger, reinforced against torpedoes. Their holds were larger, designed for the endless flow of ammunition, jeeps, fuel, and food that sustained armies across continents. Even their living quarters improved. Larger bunks, better ventilation, stronger heating. For the sailors who had endured the grueling conditions aboard Liberty ships, this was a revelation. They called them Cadillacs of the convoy. The first of these new giants, the SS United Victory, launched in February 1944, and her performance exceeded every expectation. She cut through the waves like no cargo vessel before her, arriving ahead of schedule, burning less fuel and handling rough seas with grace. Her success triggered a new phase in American shipbuilding. 534 Victory ships would be built before the war's end. Each launch marked not just another vessel at sea, but another symbol of American adaptability. The German Kriegsmarine, which once terrorized Allied convoys, now faced a logistical nightmare. These new ships were faster, harder to detect and better protected. U-boat captains lamented that the fat, slow ships they once preyed upon had vanished. The ocean, once their hunting ground, had become their graveyard. By 1945, Victory ships were everywhere, hauling supplies to Patton's advancing armies in Europe, delivering planes and vehicles to island-hopping forces in the Pacific, and returning home with wounded soldiers and prisoners of war. When Japan finally surrendered, these ships didn't fade into obscurity. They became the backbone of post-war commerce, carrying goods to rebuild shattered nations, including the very countries they had once opposed. The Victory ships represented the culmination of everything America had learned from the fire of war, the fusion of innovation, determination, and compassion. Their creation proved that even amid destruction, humanity could build something enduring. In their gleaming hulls and roaring engines lived a promise that the might of industry, once harnessed for war, could be redirected toward peace. The Victory ships were not merely the vessels of a military triumph, they were the blueprint of a world reborn. They were not generals, admirals, or men of medals. They were welders, ordinary Americans with extraordinary purpose. In the flickering light of their torches, the arsenal of democracy took shape. When Henry Kaiser's shipyards roared to life, it wasn't the engineers or managers who held the line between success and failure, it was the welders, the men and women who turned raw steel into vessels of war. In the heat of their sparks, America's destiny was forged. At the start of World War II, welding was still a relatively new trade in shipbuilding. Riveting had long been the standard, slow, laborious, and manpower-intensive. But Kaiser's yards didn't have the luxury of time. So he did what no traditionalist dared. He bet the war on welding. Instead of bolts and rivets, he demanded seams of molten steel, fused by human hands and blazing fire. It was faster, cheaper, and lighter, and as history would prove, stronger. Yet for those holding the torches, it was no easy task. Many had never seen a ship before, much less built one. Some came from farms in the Midwest, others from steel towns or small cities. They were trained in weeks, not months. Men and women side by side, learning to fuse steel that would cross oceans. They worked through night shifts, 12 hours a day, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. The shipyards glowed brighter than any skyline in America. Sparks fell like rain as hundreds of welders lined the hulls, crawling over scaffolds and catwalks, their faces hidden behind heavy masks, their sweat mixing with smoke. The work was dangerous, unbearably hot, often blinding, and constantly loud. One mistake could ruin a weld or cost a life. But to the welders, every seam meant something. Each bead of metal carried the weight of soldiers waiting for supplies, convoys that had to reach England, and Marines who needed food and fuel on distant islands. They weren't just welding steel. They were welding hope. Kaiser understood their value and treated them like warriors. He built daycare centers for mothers, cafeterias that ran through the night, and clinics to treat burns and exhaustion. His workers weren't cogs in a machine. They were the machine. By 1943, his shipyards were producing ships at a pace no one thought possible. Entire hulls were assembled in sections, welded together like pieces of an immense puzzle. It was a revolution in industry, one powered not by executives, but by ordinary citizens with calloused hands and blistered skin. Women welders, the Rosies of the rivet line, became icons of the home front. Clad in heavy gloves and helmets, they worked alongside men with the same grit and skill. In Richmond Yard No. 2, one forewoman named Agnes Foster oversaw a crew of 50 and outproduced every other team in her section. "We were welding ships faster than we could count them," she said. Every spark felt like it was lighting up freedom. Their pride was justified. By 1945, over 700,000 shipyard workers had built 2,110 Liberty ships and hundreds of Victory ships, each welded plate a testament to their endurance. Accidents were frequent, but morale never faltered. In the break rooms, they pinned up photos of the ships they'd finished, Liberty, Victory, Hope, and marked their names on the hulls before launch. Some even welded secret initials into hidden seams, tiny signatures on floating monuments to their labor. And when the whistles blew for another launch, they gathered as a family, watching a vessel slide into the water, knowing their hands had built something eternal. When the war ended, many welders hung up their masks and returned home. Their names never appeared in history books, but their legacy burned brighter than any medal. The ships they built carried armies, won battles, and fed nations. In the glow of their torches, they didn't just build ships, they built victory. Their fire was the fire that lit the path to freedom. Across the vast expanse of the Atlantic and Pacific, the true measure of victory wasn't in the number of ships built, but in how many reached their destination. Every Liberty and Victory ship that left port carried not just steel and supplies, but the hopes of millions. These convoys were the veins through which the lifeblood of Allied strength flowed. Fuel, ammunition, food, and men, all bound for the front lines. Without them, no invasion could land, no army could march, and no air force could fly. The welded hulls forged in Kaiser's shipyards were about to face the greatest test imaginable, survival in the most dangerous waters on Earth. The Battle of the Atlantic had been raging long before. Kaiser's miracles hit the sea. German U-boats, the silent predators of the deep, prowled the shipping lanes like wolves waiting for a chance to strike. They had already sent thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the ocean floor. But now the tide was shifting. With America's new welded ships coming off the lines faster than the enemy could sink them, the equation of war was beginning to change. For every Liberty ship lost, 3 more were launched. It was an industrial rhythm that the Axis could not match. Still, the danger remained. Convoys moved slowly, often at just 8 knots, forming long columns stretching to the horizon. They were guarded by destroyers and corvettes, their sonar pinging in the darkness, searching for threats below. For the crews aboard those merchant ships, every journey was a gamble. In the engine rooms, the smell of oil and hot steel filled the air. Men worked in constant tension, listening for the distant thud of depth charges or the haunting whoosh of a torpedo. Above deck, lookouts scanned the waves through salt-stung eyes, watching for periscopes glinting in the moonlight. When the alarm sounded, "Submarine off the port bow," the calm turned to chaos in seconds. Gunners ran to their stations, loading shells into anti-aircraft guns and deck cannons ready to fight back. The Liberty and Victory ships, though never designed as warships, had teeth of their own. Armed with a 5-inch gun at the stern and several 20mm or 40mm cannons, these cargo giants became makeshift fortresses on the sea. Their welded seams held strong even under fire, proof of the innovation that had made them possible. Crews spoke of torpedoes striking welded plates that refused to buckle, a testament to the new construction methods that had replaced the old rivets. In one convoy to Murmansk, a Liberty ship named SS Jeremiah O'Brien took near-miss explosions from U-boats, but kept steaming through icy waters, her hull intact. Her crew, mostly young men who had never seen battle, manned their guns through blizzards and black nights, knowing that their cargo of tanks and fuel was worth more than their lives. They were sailors, but they were also soldiers, fighting not for glory but for survival. As the war dragged on, the convoy system became more organized, more efficient and more deadly to the enemy. Allied air cover expanded, sonar technology improved, and new escort carriers brought aircraft directly to the battle. The balance had shifted decisively. The welded Liberty and Victory ships were now moving in unstoppable waves, resupplying distant fronts and enabling invasions from Normandy to Okinawa. They were the quiet heroes of the war, their missions unheralded yet indispensable. Every ship that reached port meant another victory on the battlefield. Without them, the guns would fall silent and the tanks would stand still. When the final victory came, it was not only the generals who had earned it, but also the welders, the builders, and the sailors who had braved the seas in their steel giants. The convoy lifeline was more than logistics. It was the beating heart of freedom. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and peace rolled in like a tired tide, the world looked upon the seas with a kind of reverence. Scattered across the Atlantic and Pacific were the silhouettes of ships that had carried more than just cargo. They had carried civilization itself. The Victory and Liberty ships, once born from desperation and welded in defiance, had become floating monuments to human ingenuity. They were not glamorous vessels nor built for beauty. Their sides bore scars from storms and shrapnel. Their decks carried memories of men who had laughed, fought, and died among the steel. Yet in their simplicity, they embodied everything that had won the war: resolve, speed, and unity. At the heart of that legacy was the ridiculous welding trick that changed everything. When Henry Kaiser's engineers first proposed building ships with welded seams rather than rivets, the idea was mocked by traditionalists. Rivets had ruled shipbuilding for centuries, symbols of reliability. Welding, on the other hand, was considered risky, unstable, even dangerous. But necessity has always been the mother of innovation, and in the heat of war, necessity burned bright. The result was nothing short of revolutionary. Welded hulls didn't just cut down construction time, they made ships lighter, stronger, and easier to repair. What once took 40 days now took 5. It was as if America had found a way to turn time itself into a weapon. In 5 days, a skeleton of steel would rise from sparks and scaffolds, slide into the water, and within weeks it would be crossing oceans filled with death and destiny. Each ship carried more than supplies. It carried the invisible strength of a nation united under pressure, its welders and laborers working around the clock, their torches glowing like stars in an industrial night. After the war, many of these ships were scrapped or sold, their missions complete. Yet others found new life in peacetime, converted into cargo carriers, training vessels, or hospital ships. Some were sent to remote corners of the world, where they became floating schools, grain stores, or even entire communities. The oceans they once crossed in war now carried them in peace. But their true legacy was invisible. the transformation of how humanity built for its future. The welded ship revolution spilled over into every industry. Bridges, aircraft, buildings, and pipelines all bore the mark of that wartime breakthrough. Welding had proven itself on the world's deadliest stage and emerged as the foundation of modern engineering. In the years that followed, engineers would look back at Kaiser's shipyards and say, that was where the future was forged. Among the few surviving vessels today, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien and SS John W. Brown still sail, living ghosts of a time when the world's fate rested on steel and courage. Their hulls, still tight after 8 decades, are a testament to the miracle of welded warcraft. Visitors who walk their decks can almost hear the echo of welders' torches, the clang of hammers, the hum of engines, and the laughter of tired men who had built ships faster than enemies could sink them. They were not just ships. They were stories made of metal, each seam a sentence in the saga of survival. As the sun sets over their rusted rails, one truth endures. Wars are not only won by those who fire the guns, but also by those who forge the means to fight. The ridiculous trick that once defied logic had reshaped destiny. Out of fire and steel, America had built its legacy, not just in victory but in vision. The shipyards of World War II had done more than build ships. They had built the future.